Thank you, Pramod. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you. It's morning in Alabama, so it's a wonderful way to wake up to be able to chair this session. So our session is on the future of Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think what would be useful to hear from the panelists, and I'm not going to introduce them again. Thank you, Pramod, for doing that. We have a really amazing group of panelists to talk about, I would think, from a future perspective. So in terms of what does the Indo-Pacific mean in terms of international relations, in terms of grand strategy, as well in terms of what's going to come. So for me, when I think about the future of the Indo-Pacific, there are three things that comes to mind. One is that this region is going to be and has already become an economically very viable region in the world. So a lot of the technological innovation in terms of not just economic power projection, but also grand strategic thinking, influence in terms of how great powers would behave, for example, the US, China, India to a large extent. And then finally, I think something that I think through is that when we think about demographics, the Indo-Pacific is going to become one of the most youngest in terms of population, but also in terms of one of the most skilled. So what this means in terms of high-end technologies like space, artificial intelligence, quantum communication, the integration of this in terms of the region is going to be extremely vital. And then finally, the Indo-Pacific is also a region where we still have certain regional and territorial conflicts. So we have border and boundary issues between India and China. We have disputed islands, for example, between some of the ASEAN member states and China, and then China and Japan. So in that context, I think it will be really useful to hear from our panelists as to what their view is in terms of the future of the Indo-Pacific. As Pramod said, we have about 120 minutes, so I'm going to be strict with time. So each panelist has 10 minutes. And when we reach the 9-minute mark, I'm going to remind you. And so I really look forward to this interactive panel. So the first panelist is Dr. Amit Gupta, Senior Advisor, Forum of Federation, Canada. The floor is yours, Dr. Gupta.
Okay, thank you. I'll set my timer for 10 minutes. There we go. Okay.
You're not
Here's
visible.
the basic, sorry?
You're not visible.
I'm not visible? Okay. Now I'm visible. There we go. All right, look, when you look at the Quad, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, all the discussion is framed in London, Washington, Brussels. It's not really coming out of the Indo-Pacific in a way that it should. And let me explain. What are the two alternatives for a security architecture in the region? A, the Quad, B, AUKUS. Neither one of them makes much sense. Let's be very clear, the Quad is not a Quad, it's a 3+1. Because militarily, technologically, economically, India doesn't fit in seamlessly with the United States, Japan, and Australia. You can take a Japanese officer, and if he speaks English, you can put him on an Aegis-class destroyer, which is American, or an Aegis-class destroyer, which is Australian, and he'll work just fine on either one of them. That doesn't happen with India. Politically, India has its own qualms about where the Quad should be headed, even though this seems to be the Black Forest tort of international security in the region, lots of conferences, etc. The second problematic one is AUKUS. And here's several problems here. One, the Australians have clearly said, we're not going to fight in Taiwan. Then why do you need nuclear submarines? I mean, that would be my question. Two, it's not clear when these submarines will come or whether Trump will even give them, because the United States has very meager production facilities right now. And there is some talk on Capitol Hill that do we give submarines to the Australians when we can ill afford being so generous? So those are the, keep in mind, then there's the optics of it. When the United States, Britain, and Australia decide to create the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific, and there's no Asian country involved, I have to sit and ask what's going on. Having said this, as our chair pointed out, this is the region of opportunity. 66% of global growth in 2023 was in Asia. And if you look at Asia's, or if you look at the GDP of China, Japan, and South Korea today, it is 30% higher than the 27 countries in the EU. And you put Britain back into the EU, it still won't make much of a difference. The future in that sense is very much Asia. So where do you go with this? If A, the security regimes don't look that promising, at least from my opinion. Two, Asia is an area of global growth. And I'll add a third thing to this. You have to look at how much money is being created by bilateral trade in the Indo-Pacific region. And the best way to see this is just look at this screen that I'm sharing here. Can you all see it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, just look at how much trade China does with everybody in the region. With ASEAN, it's got 911 billion, with Japan, 321 billion, with South Korea, 316 billion, with the Australians, 232 billion. That's in real dollars, not in Australian dollars. So we're talking real money here. So you put all this together, this leads to something which is very clear cut. And that is, if you're worried about China militarily, at the same time, there are enormous economic benefits from cooperating with China. So how do you balance these two? And my way of looking at this is a bit different from Washington, Brussels, London. My way of looking at it is there is an organic Indo-Pacific way of doing this. And that is that quite simply you get the BRICS approach to this. Because you take out the Brazilians, everybody else in the BRICS falls within the Indo-Pacific region, especially the Egyptians now that the Red Sea has become a hotspot area. So what can the BRICS do, which complements, let's say, bigger strategies coming out of the West? And my answer to you there would be, there's a bunch of things which they can do where you would see very high levels of cooperation between these countries, as well as everybody else in Asia. Anti-piracy is already going on. I don't have to talk about that one. Humanitarian relief, if you see what has been done by countries in the Indo-Pacific, it's very impressive. The Indians were the ones who were the first responders in Nepal when the big earthquake happened. The Australians were the big responders, and the New Zealanders, by the way. In Fiji, when they were hit by a typhoon, I can go down the list. You can make this an institutional effort, not just a sort of sporadic, event-driven effort. Third thing is environmental. Stretching from Maldives to the South Pacific, we're seeing the negative effects of the environmental degradation of the region. The Maldives, as somebody pointed out on the panel I was chairing yesterday, is going rapidly underwater, or at least parts of it are, and that would be one of the great humanitarian disasters of the world. There are the issues in the South Pacific with fisheries and so on, which many of you are better versed than I am. Then there's the issue of maritime security, where I would say that the countries of the region can do a lot if they start to talk about this seriously. One very simple example was in the 2003 African Union Summit in Mozambique. It was the Indians who provided the maritime security. They sat there with their ships, made sure that nothing untoward happened. So these are the kinds of things that you can do, and it's a growth trajectory. And add to this cyber, add to this educational training. I can go down the list on this. What I would say is what this requires is not talking in terms of great power politics. That's going to happen regardless of what people in the region say, but talking in terms of what can be done within the region. And let's remember, the region starts from South Africa and goes to the coasts of Latin America and the United States, if you're going to look at it. It's not the American conception of it, which is it ends with India. Now, there's a very large swath of the Indian Ocean which comes to the west of India, with some very important countries in it. So essentially, my argument would be we need to be talking very seriously, and there is a lot of good work going on in the region about bringing the countries of the region together to deal with regional problems rather than obsess with power politics, which quite frankly, half the countries in the region can do nothing about because everybody's doing one very simple thing. They're hedging. Because I'll end by quoting a South Korean scholar, Chung-Min Lee, who says, everybody likes China's economic efforts since we all benefit from them. We're all concerned about China's military forays. The military forays part is one part which will be addressed globally. It won't be just addressed regionally. Regionally, I think the economic issues and the environmental issues and the local security, non-traditional security issues become important. Okay, thank you very much. 1 minute, 39 seconds left.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for keeping to the time. I thought what you pointed out in terms of, one, where are the strategic narratives originating in terms of how the region is framed is something that I think we should discuss, because how much does the context of the United States presence in the Indo-Pacific matter? The second thing, which I agree with you, is that we really need to think seriously about how the future in terms of economic and demographics that comes from the Indo-Pacific frames this entire area. And I thought the final point in terms of how the states across the region are responding to the first of all, the concerns about the rise of China, whether they're hedging, whether they're actually responding, is something I would find useful in terms of discussing actually as to what are their strategies, because in the chart you showed, the economic relationship with China is very deep across the region. So thank you for that. Next, we have Ms. Nilanthi Samaranayake, visiting expert, United States Institute of Peace. Nilanthi, it's wonderful to see you, and good morning, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Professor Goswami. It's great to see you as well. My thanks to NICE, the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, for the invitation to participate in this important forum. I'll provide my personal views and research. So I'll make 3 points about our topic today, the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So first, in the United States, we're roughly 1 month away from inauguration of a new administration. So there's understandably some uncertainty about what strategy and policy will be under the second Trump administration. But there is value in terms of thinking about what some different futures might look like. So for scope, I'll speak about the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy from a US policy perspective and the US Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm speaking from Washington. And for assumptions, I think a useful starting point when analyzing futures is to acknowledge that we're definitely going to be missing something. So I think building in this box or placeholder is important to force ourselves to think about what those developments and wildcards might be that aren't necessarily on our radar at the moment. Second, there is a lot of work from the first Trump administration that the second Trump administration can build upon. If you recall, the Trump administration identified the Indo-Pacific really changing from that common conception or that term of using the Asia-Pacific. It really identified and articulated the Indo-Pacific as a strategic region of interest for the United States in the 2017 National Security Strategy. And the following year, it renamed U.S. Pacific Command to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in 2018. And then the following year, the administration released key strategy and implementation reports in 2019. For example, from the Pentagon, the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, and from the State Department, the Advancing a Free and Indo-Pacific document. And both of these documents examined the administration's work on implementing its strategy toward the Indo-Pacific. And then in 2021, the administration declassified its document called the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, which, as you can see, it details different strategies and policies toward different countries in the region. So there is a lot of work that the incoming Trump administration can build upon based upon its previous work on the region. And then third, I think when we're thinking about futures, different types of alternate futures, using courses of actions framework can be useful, courses of actions or COAs, in terms of thinking about, or in terms of trying to structure our thinking about the future. So I'll offer three. I think one, we can pursue a status quo COA or course of action. I think we can think about a COA that involves really little change or changes on the margin. And then I think third, we can envision a COA that involves big changes. So first, in terms of a status quo COA, this really focuses on the continuities between the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and then the incoming Trump second administration when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. Essentially, there are structural interests for the United States as a nation. The competition with China is arguably the biggest strategic factor in terms of U.S. thinking for the next several years. And the Quad, that's one example of an initiative that's really come out of some of these strategic developments. We saw with the first Trump administration, really the resurrection of the Quad initiative between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And that initiative really has only grown in the Trump administration at the foreign ministers level, growing to the heads of state, heads of government level. So it's really been upwards. And of course, different views among the participants, as we've already heard today. But still, I think this is an initiative that we could expect to receive continued attention under the incoming Trump administration. And then the second COA is really thinking about changes on the margin. Essentially some continuities, but we can think about some of the rhetoric that we heard during the presidential campaign and listen to that. And for example, officials talking about greater burden sharing that would be expected by the United States for its allies. Another factor is thinking about personnel decisions that are being made for incoming officials, like people and their stances toward China. And so from those factors, we can think about what policy implementation could look like. And perhaps for some of these changes to be made, it could take up to 2 years, perhaps, to see some results being delivered from alliance partners. We just heard a discussion about AUKUS. We can certainly consider AUKUS. Is this an initiative where we could see potentially some changes being made, marginal changes from the US side? And then finally is really significant changes COA, big changes. So either a significant stepping up of alliances and partnerships, and then perhaps even a stepping down in terms of these partnerships, depending on the particular countries. There's been a lot of discussion in the news about US alliance commitments toward South Korea. So is that one COA we could think about? So to conclude, those are really 3 COAs to think about. And I'll mention this is just one way of thinking about potential futures, and they're certainly not exclusive of each other. We don't have to be limited to just picking one. We could see marginal changes, perhaps in one sub-region of the Indo-Pacific, or major changes in another subregion, or in a topical area like defense. Maybe perhaps marginal changes in defense, but major changes in terms of economics, as in COA 3. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nilanthi. I thought your three frameworks are useful. The two questions, and this you can answer later when we open it up for discussion. The two questions that came to mind is one, I think the audience would find it very useful if we kind of understand what was the tonality and organizational shift that actually occurred when you renamed the region from the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. So that would be like what happened in terms of grand strategy for the US, in terms of organizational change, and why that shift, right? Besides just the renaming. And then the second thing is when you look at your three frameworks that you offered in terms of small shifts to major shifts, how much does Trump's the America First policy affect how nations are going to react to the second Trump administration in the Pacific? So, well, thank you for that. And so let's move on. So the next speaker is Dr. Miao Ji, Research Fellow, China Foreign Affairs University, China. And so the floor is yours, Dr. Ji, for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the NIS for this kind invitation to such a very important event. I really love to engage such a group of very distinguished panelists. We are going to talk about the future of Indo-Pacific strategy instead of the region itself. So I think that assessment must be based on four basic facts. I think the first is that the Indo-Pacific has already developed into a global agenda, especially when it evolved from a mere concept into individual strategy of say, the Accord members, then ASEAN, the European members, the European Union as a whole, and then Canada, South Korea. So it's already been a global agenda. And the second is that the logic of the Indo-Pacific strategy, of the multiple Indo-Pacific strategies, would be to address the, say, challenge by greater alignment across a greater geographical scope. So I think that logic is still remain very true today and in the following years. And third would be that a set of institutions, including those I mentioned at the Quad, at the AUKUS, the IPEF, and a lot of multilateral organizations like the US, Japan, South Korea cooperation, US, Japan, the Philippines, and plus a lot of emerging or existing ones. And third would be a fact I would like to mention is that the possible effect of the Trump over the Indo-Pacific strategies for those nations may have been overestimated. Because the Indo-Pacific actually is a Japanese initiative, and it only became materialized during the Trump's first term. And Biden administration has done almost everything that Trump hoped to but failed to do, or hoped to but haven't seriously done. So, and he also left a very vibrant network of alliances across the region. So I should say, actually, in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy, we are going to expect a Trump 3.0 instead of 2.0 version. So I see a more consistent and continuities for the Indo-Pacific strategy, and I should say that we still going to live with a much stronger or ever strong Indo-Pacific strategies or strategic coalitions across the region. And of course, the challenges are there. And from the US side, I propose many scholars have already discussed. It's about the Trump's American First doctrine. Maybe let's say the IPAD the alliance may have some problem, and he's going to text almost all alliance, including Japan, Korea, and European partners. And APEC may be in danger, and he probably will have less commitment to alliances and prefer some more unilateral approaches across the region. And his agenda must be probably will be more domestic policy centered. So that will put the Indo-Pacific future, how you see, in a very different scenario. And I think another very important factor to observe would be the Japan factor, because Japan remains very critical player in the Pacific. It is the chief designer, I should say. He is also a key moderator among the different powers, especially between the United States and many Indo-Pacific partners. And also, I say that Japan's economic and security network, especially economic network or people-to-people ties across Indo-Pacific, has been critical for eating up that network. So while the Ishiba government, I should say, he has already showed some a relatively more nuanced or balanced approach between the United States and China, and show some autonomy or independence in terms of the security terms. So I should say maybe the two combined, the Trump and Ishiba combined, may lead to some, I should say, some change or uncertainties to the Indo-Pacific strategies. And in terms of the future of the Indo-Pacific, I should say that it will be based on, it will be very much relevant to who's in the Pacific strategy, because in the Pacific strategy has different versions depending on who it is. So who's in the Pacific matters. And we don't have a unified version, though we have we say very much Americanized version, because almost all powers have accommodated the United States in the Pacific region or mandates. But we still say a lot of differences, and we may see more change during the Trump's second term. And the other thing is that the power structure within the region, and it's also the external factors beyond the Indo-Pacific region may have a greater effect on the Indo-Pacific in the future, in the following years, especially like the Ukraine war in Europe and also the Middle East. And say powers like non-Indo-Pacific power like Russian, I think their role in the let's say post Ukraine period may make a huge difference to that. And also, I want to mention that we should not forget the global South. So their role in the Indo-Pacific should be very critical and should not be neglected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. G. I thought the one point that you said in terms of the global influence of the Indo-Pacific, I think that's vital, because when you think about the future of the globe in terms of economics, in terms of demographics, technology, I would find a useful discussion on what are the nations of the Indo-Pacific looking, including China, in terms of what technologies to build, right? For example, space, AI, how is that going to impact? So a question for you is that if you look at the Chinese comprehensive strategy in the future, what are the technological innovations that China is hoping to invest in, say by 2030, 2040, that's going to have a deep impact on how the regional frameworks are established? I thought your point in terms of, for example, Quad and where it actually originated as an idea, which is Japan, was vital. So something to think about is when you say that Japan is the shaper and the designer in terms of the frameworks, I would be interested to hear a little bit more your perspective in terms of historical Japan and how is Japan actually navigating this designing based on the argument you made that Japan is seemingly becoming more autonomous and independent in terms of its strategic thinking. So you can answer that later in terms of when the discussions are, but thank you for your perspective. Next, we have Antoine Levesques. He is from the International Institute for Strategic Studies as a research fellow. Antoine, great to see you. I remember our days at IDSA, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Well, good day to you, Dr. Goswami. Good day to Pramod, the team, and indeed to all of you on the call. It's a wonderful opportunity. Congratulations to NICE for such a big meeting managed over a couple of days with a really great range of speakers, including from China and Russia. I think this is very, very important and, of course, timely. I don't speak for any government, but I will discuss the issue at hand from more of a European perspective, being based in London, although I do a lot of my work in South Asia. So really, I want to make three quick points. The first is to say that from a European perspective, Indo-Pacific strategies are there to stay. That's the first one. The second one is about the role of technology, and Dr. Goswami has discussed this, and I know she's done a lot of work on this in the last few years. And the third point I want to make is around the importance of para-diplomacy and dialogues at various levels to help understand each other better. So to the first point, Indo-Pacific strategies, as I think we all agree, are there to stay. There are trends in prosperity and security, which many before me in this discussion, the wider conference and outside have discussed, which all coincide to seeing the Indo-Pacific being central to not just prosperity, but also security in the next generation. Seen from a European perspective, there's an obvious question about the extent to which prioritization of the Indo-Pacific can take place at a time when Euro-Atlantic security is very much at the top of policymakers' priority lists. And we've a few new governments in major European countries, the UK, of course, France, and as of the next few weeks, likely in Germany also. The Ukraine war and its shadow over European security here is the main issue, although in the background there is the question of Russia's strategic behavior and intentions for the next few years towards Europe. And that's not just NATO Europe, by the way. Some of these issues were discussed in great detail at a recent new IISS forum involving defense chiefs in Prague. I think from a European and particularly UK perspective, if you're looking at Indo-Pacific intentions, if you look at what the UK particularly has been saying since the new Labour government has been in power since early July, you just need to look at a major statement by Minister Catherine West, who spoke at the IISS in an event we run with the Canadian, Singapore, and Indian High Commissions a couple of weeks ago. That transcript is on the internet, to see that for the UK, and I quote here, the Indo-Pacific is a generational mission. It's a long-term posture, and it is not just a short-term set of sound bites. So I think the commitment there is very clear, but at the same time, there are questions around this prioritization, and this comes down also to budgets, and these questions will be, I think, becoming clearer as the UK's ongoing strategic defense review and spending review will conclude in the earlier weeks of next year. So all of this to say that there are plenty of national-based initiatives which target the Indo-Pacific. Its major players, of course, India, the US, China, and other big countries, either economically or in security terms. Those include Singapore, for example, Australia, etc. But I think because we are here hosted by NICE, it's very important to remember that South Asia itself matters to most Indo-Pacific strategies which are being put forward. Obviously, the maritime domain is the first order of priority here, with a focus on interoperability, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this take place, not just in the context of the Quad, but bilateral partnerships, perhaps also in the context of AUKUS. But if you're looking at a country which is landlocked like Nepal or Bhutan, you're really looking at other things here. You're looking at how India, Western countries, and each of these countries, Nepal or Bhutan, can come together in ways which do benefit the countries of the region, with the acknowledgement that there is strategic competition ongoing in South Asia. So a little more on this afterwards, but this brings me to my second point about technology. it's very obvious that technology matters both to the security and prosperity objectives of major countries today. This is central to their approaches to the Indo-Pacific. And technology plays a key part in the formulation or the latest iteration of their strategic partnership approaches towards not just the major countries of the region, the Indias, the Chinas, but also smaller countries. I think here the main issue and complication is that technology is not necessarily an ask from countries such as Nepal, for instance. At the same time, though, there are opportunities to ensure that initiatives in, say, the space domain can benefit the whole of South Asia. These can bring in conveniently a country like India and some of its supporters outside. You can look at climate change initiatives, climate finance, but also practical projects. And there are plenty, I think, of opportunities for cooperation to happen. Even with China, I think cooperation of a tailored sort on cyber criminality, for example, of the sort which is cross-border and destabilizing, can be really important. But at the heart of those approaches, there needs to be the agency of the so-called smaller countries. This is something I talk about a lot with colleagues in some of our Track 2 and Track 1.5 initiatives, and I've written about this with my colleague Biraj Solanki from the IISS. The agency has to be, if not the starting point, at least co-equal to some of the objectives which countries have in terms of the Indo-Pacific. Technology can forward cooperation in that sense, but it's important to take practical steps. One of those, for example, could be that as Western countries in particular develop the concept or create the positions for tech envoys, but they should send those envoys not just to the major countries like India or others, but should send them to smaller countries like Nepal, for example, for discussions about opportunities for cooperation, but also to help clarify what these countries, these major economies stand for and do not actually stand for, to dispel misconceptions. And this brings me to my last point about paradiplomacy. I think many of us are familiar with the importance of unofficial Track 2 or Track 1.5 contact involving serving officials. It is very clear to me that as the going becomes tougher, as the opportunities for misunderstandings increase generally, it's very important to have two types of dialogues. Dialogues which help clarify assumptions between friends, but also potentially between rivals that can range from defense, security, but prosperity issues, which are all connected. It's very important to understand, again, the asks of countries such as Nepal and others in South Asia. And the second category is the contacts which aim to discuss the possibility of major crises which would have a cross-regional impact in the Indo-Pacific. There can be specific cases which tie specific countries, but also more major widespread diffuse crises, which could do with HADR contingencies, climate change, etc. So there's plenty of scope for contact, for defense diplomacy, such as the IISS exercises, the Shangri-La Dialogue, and in other meetings, but also a range of other meetings. So I want to leave it on this note, and I look forward to our questions. Dr. Goswami, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. I thought I'm really happy that you brought in the framing of the small states. I know Nilanthi works on that. So Nilanthi, you might have to answer this question with Antoine, that when we think about the Indo-Pacific region, a lot of the framing is done from the perspective of major powers, and they set the conversations, especially in terms of security, if not in terms of economics, because smaller nations are thinking about how they're going to contribute and develop themselves, but how much are they actually framing their own strategies in terms of responding to that kind of framing? For example, a conflictual situation, hypothetically, say, between China and India in their region of South Asia, right? So how are those nations responding? Initiatives like the Belt and Road Information Corridor that China has initiated, how are the nations navigating that? So thank you for that. I also really enjoyed the fact that you brought in the role of technology, because what I'm noticing in my research is that if I talk about space, technology is used not just for developing national capacity, but also as a tool of diplomacy, as you mentioned. So a little bit more on that later would be an interesting point of discussion. To those of us in the chat, if you have questions for the panelists, I would really appreciate if you put it in the chat to which panelist you are directing it to in the interest of time, and I'll read out your questions if I have them in order. Our next panelist is Dr. Eva Pejsova, Japan Chair, Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, Brussels School of Governance, Belgium. The chair is yours, Dr. Pejsova.
Thank you, Professor Goswami, and many thanks to Nice, to the organizers, for bringing me over virtually to Kathmandu. I wish I could one day visit in person. But without prior guidance, I have to admit that I also wanted to talk from the European perspective. So my apologies if there's going to be a little bit of an overlap with Antoine's presentation, and I think that there will be overlaps with other speakers. So I'll try to navigate this and probably be a bit briefer than even 10 minutes. But well, of course, I guess the main point, what I was trying to say, is just to focus a little bit on what the Europe's role or engagement in the Indo-Pacific is, what the future from Europe looks like, and what are some of the main challenges that we're facing. And I guess the main point here is really to underscore how incredibly interconnected the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific space has become. With, of course, the biggest turning point being the war in Ukraine. As you know, the EU has its Indo-Pacific strategy. It came up with it arguably late and was very slow in formulating it. It only came in 2021. And by the way, it's called the Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So in a way, it's very much aligned to the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or the Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific vision, if you want. So it's not a security strategy, but it really encompasses all the aspects, including economic cooperation, integration, governance, climate, and you name it. And you find similar allusions in French or the Dutch or the German strategy. So it's much more what we call comprehensive way of looking in the Indo-Pacific. But of course, the war in Ukraine, as much as many may have thought would be a distraction from the new EU's or European Indo-Pacific tilt, it actually served as a catalyst and frankly deeply transformed the way we look at the Indo-Pacific and the way we consider our role or possible contribution to stability in the Indo-Pacific. Well, first of all, it definitely altered the perception of China. I think it's not a secret that the Chinese support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has plummeted its image among the European public and policy community alike. China is now considered as a major challenge, not only to our security, immediate security, directly and indirectly, but of course to our partners in the region. And the whole worrying trend of adversarial alignments that we see with China, Russia in the first front, but also North Korea or Iran, or the axis of upheaval, is something that we consider in Europe as, I believe, the single defining threat in the years to come that is probably here to stay. The examples of the implication of this alignment are multifaceted, both geographically in 3rd theaters. We can see the influence operations in the Middle East, in Africa, but also concrete, just with the recent examples of cutting of undersea cables, which does pose a lot of problems in undersea infrastructure establishments in the Arctic, etc., etc. But there are also the good news. And since a lot of the talk here has been about the kind of new security architecture in the region, I think it's really worth underscoring how much the war in Ukraine or the European Indo-Pacific outlook brought Europe and its like-minded partners closer together. And here I'm referring mostly to Japan and Korea, the more like-minded one. And we see this emergence of a network-like security architecture in the region. We talked about AUKUS, we talked about Quad. We did not mention the many minilaterals that have mushroomed since the Biden administration with Japan, South Korea, US, Japan, Philippines, the US, the Squad, you name it. Of course, the question now whether they will survive in the second Trump administration, given also Japan's relatively weaker domestic political situation, is a question. But it is also these partnerships that Europe has been working on very actively and is trying to explore some sort of minilateral cooperation. The other good news, I would imagine, and it's out of necessity, is that of course Europeans and all these other partners are going to invest much more into their own security, simply because we are not sure about the US security guarantees under the upcoming administrations. But this is a trend that has already started in 2016, so it is likely going to continue. Another, again, feature on the security architecture front that has not been mentioned is NATO. And of course, I'm not going to open the debate about NATO's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but it really boils down to the kind of global nature of threats that are including in the technological area or information space that we, of course, need to work in common. The bad news, and it has been mentioned throughout, is that we are facing an Indo-Pacific that is already and will become much more polarized, and where all the spheres of international relations, being economy, even diplomatic ties or cultural ties or technology, is going to become a victim of weaponization. This is something that is going to be much more accentuated probably in the decade to come. And we're risking to more and more get to this black and white vision of the good, the bad, and the in-between. Of course, we all know that the smaller and middle-sized countries are trying to avoid this painful choice of who to join. And talking in Nepal and in Southeast Asia or South Asia, it's really the leitmotif of the day. But the risk is that it's a fight that we will be losing. When you look at some of the statistics, some of the surveys, either by the ISEAS State of Southeast Asia or the Low Institute Asia Power Index, it all proves that China has been actually gaining ground in Southeast Asia and in many countries. We have a problem of image, we have a problem of delivering, and the focus on fostering very good relationship between only the handful of like-minded countries has basically distracted the attention from all the others. So this actually, I think, brings back to what some other speakers have been talking, which brings me to my last point, which is that a future Indo-Pacific strategy need to be more human-centered, need to be more focused on delivering public good. It's interesting when we look at the Japanese FOIP, when we look at the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific or the European strategy for cooperation, the focus is connectivity, economic integration, maritime safety, prosperity, health, energy, you name it. It's all about cooperation that really these are the things that will gain traction. It's not about competition. And I think Antoine also mentioned that in terms of connectivity, there are projects that we can cooperate with China on to basically win back the hearts and minds. I think the chair, you mentioned several times the importance of space and AI and new technologies. Of course, if there's one thing that the European or EU is famous for, it's its regulatory power. I guess that's one area where we can contribute in a more constructive way, especially on space and AI. It is something that we work on very actively with Japan and with Korea, with Singapore, increasingly with India through the Trade and Technology Council as well. So I believe that's something we need to continue and not be completely petrified, I would say, against the great power competition dynamic, because that seems to be basically stealing all the attention while there's a lot that can be done beyond the threshold of this partnership. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Pejsova. I think one thing that we would probably like to unpack a little more with you in terms of a question when we open it up for discussion is when you talk about, for example, Europe, I think it'll be useful for the audience to learn from you, given your expertise, in terms of what is the polarized nature of European conceptions, for example, in terms of its engagement. How does, for example, a nation like France differ from, say, a nation like Serbia? So the division from Western and Eastern Europe, right? It is extremely deep in terms of how regions are conceptualized. Is there common understanding of what are the, for example, collaborative structures that are useful? And then finally, in terms of regulation as well, there's a lot of division within Europe too, in terms of how, for example, technology can be regulated. In the Indo-Pacific region, what I noticed from ASEAN is that there is a lot of push for normative guidelines at the level of the UN, and there is a little bit of hesitancy to sign on to treaties, for example, because treaties are seen as a remnant of the past, restrictive. So I would be very interested to hear your perspective on that. But thank you for your excellent remarks, and I look forward to the discussion in the question answer. Our next speaker is Lisa Curtis. She's Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security, Center for New American Security in the United States. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami, and thank you to NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaswal for inviting me here today. I actually just returned from a trip to Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And when I was in Nepal, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jaswal at his office. So it's really great to be here today and among such distinguished fellow panelists. So I would like to talk about the partnerships and multilateral groupings that the U.S. is engaged in the Indo-Pacific, with this overall goal of bringing about a stable regional order. This, of course, involves enhancing deterrence, preventing conflict, maintaining free and open seaways, and protecting the sovereignty and independence of the regional nations. And I think the partnerships that the United States is building are catalyzing greater cooperation on all the issues that we've been hearing about: maritime security, creating new and resilient supply chains, developing and deploying cutting-edge technologies, and of course, protecting trade and energy flows. And so I think all of these interlocking partnerships that the U.S. has been fostering really build what I like to call a networked security architecture. So I would like to talk about what we're likely to see from a second Trump administration when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region. And to start off with, I would just I would encourage everybody to read the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, which was the document that drove the first Trump administration's policy toward the Indo-Pacific, and of course was released to the public in January 2021. And I will note there is a robust South Asia section in that strategy. So for starters, the Quad, I think, will remain a very important forum for engagement in this region. It, of course, was revived under Trump 1, and it's since become an effective multilateral mechanism to support the concepts that I just mentioned: sovereignty and independence of nations, free and open seaways, transparent lending and investment, broad-based economic development, and peaceful resolution of disputes. So it's not a military pact, but it really is about these powerful maritime democracies coming together with a shared vision of the region and pooling their resources and capabilities to realize that vision. And the Quad met for the fourth time in person during the Biden administration in September. And there were some very important announcements on maritime security cooperation. They talked about a maritime security training initiative, a maritime legal dialogue to uphold the rules-based maritime order. This is very important, as well as a Quad Coast Guard observer mission to improve interoperability and advance maritime security. So I think we can expect that these initiatives would be continued into the second Trump administration. Another initiative, multilateral initiative, that I see the Trump administration continuing from the Biden administration is the AUKUS initiative. And AUKUS is really about, and this, of course, is the Australia, UK, US initiative to provide Australia with nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines, and also with a Pillar 2 to develop advanced capabilities among three nations. But it really is about collective military deterrence. It's about burden sharing. It's about providing the closest allies of the United States access to advanced capabilities that they need to be able to contribute to maintaining a peaceful Indo-Pacific. So I think that, that initiative will certainly continue. It's already moving forward. It's part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, enabling the transfer of technology for the AUKUS program. And I think, it's clear that the incoming National Security Advisor, Michael Waltz, and the Secretary of State designate, Marco Rubio, both have shown in their congressional record that they will prioritize competition with China and everything that entails, whether it's greater investment in U.S. defense capabilities, more export controls on high technologies, restrictions on certain U.S. investments into China, efforts to develop alternative supply chains for critical minerals and technologies, or just clearly signaling that the U.S. will defend Taiwan and allies like the Philippines that have been subject to Chinese maritime aggression. So speaking of maritime realm, I think it's also important that we monitor what's happening in the Indian Ocean region. This is a very important region. India has traditionally been leading efforts to secure and stabilize this region. And we have seen efforts to try to control sea lines of communications in the South China Sea. And we don't want to see that kind of activity starting in the Indian Ocean region. And I think, we have to be cognizant of the so-called gray zone tactics, which involve intimidation, coercion, psychological warfare, disinformation, misinformation. And, we've seen it in the South China Sea in Chinese actions against the Philippines with, water cannons against maritime vessels and other bullying tactics, really. And so I think, the point is the Indian Ocean region, we certainly don't want to see that become a center of aggression or intimidation. And I think, this is something we just need to keep our eyes on as we move forward. So the last topic I will touch on is that of critical minerals. Certainly, critical minerals are foundational to the transition to renewable sources of energy. Minerals such as copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements are needed for clean energy technologies like wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, etc. But certainly China controls 2/3 of the global supply of critical minerals and is responsible for about 80% of the global processing of things like copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. And we have seen that China has started to exercise leverage over global mineral supplies, as demonstrated by its decision to control the export of gallium, germanium, and antimony. So this is certainly something that we need to think about in terms of resilient supply chains. And I think the establishment of the Mineral Security Partnership is a positive step, as well as the Quad announcement of a clean energy supply chain initiative. So all of these efforts can be very helpful, but I think the issue should be addressed with a greater sense of urgency. So in conclusion, certainly competing with China requires Washington to not only invest in its own technological and defense capabilities, but also to work closely with allies and partners to shape the environment of the Indo-Pacific. And U.S.-China competition need not lead to conflict. That's why it's so important to keep lines of communication and open dialogue so that the competition does not devolve into conflict. And I think Trump's invitation to President Xi to attend his inauguration, even though he didn't accept it, I think it still is a good sign that President-elect Trump understands the necessity of continuing this communication, keeping those lines of communication open, and continuing to pursue dialogue between the United States and China. So I'll just end it there. Thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Thank you, Ms. Curtins. I thought it was very useful to actually, especially for our audience in the Indo-Pacific region, to listen to you articulate as to what will the second Trump administration continue. I think there are questions on that in terms of the commitment to, for example, treaty allies. And so it's reassuring to hear that some of the, postures and support during the first Trump administration will continue. The question that I would like you to answer, and just to unpack a little bit, is that there is a lot of discussion within other nations, for example, when they hear a term like rules-based order. So the narrative is that, okay, whose rules is it? What kind of normative frameworks does it bring? So it'll be useful to unpack that. And I thought your point was important that we would see a more competitive structure because in the discussion we heard about cooperation from two of the panelists. So I thought it's important to bring that into the discussion as well. The final question I'll have is that with President Xi, as you said, not agreeing, I think there is an interesting framing that we also need to think through, and that is of leadership of the international order, right? So China, of course, is a great major power, assuming leadership of several structures. So what does that mean in terms of the second Trump administration's ability to project power, constraining, or how does it negate the rise of great powers in the Indo-Pacific? But thank you for your insights, and I look forward to your discussion. The next speaker is Dr. George I.H. Cooke, Executive Director, Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Sri Lanka. Dr. Cooke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And also a heartfelt thank you to Pramod Jaiswal and the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Pramod has a catalytic power of bringing people together from around the world, and he has done it yet again in what has transpired to be one of the largest gatherings over the last 2 days of focus on the Indo-Pacific strategy. So thank you very much, Pramod, for that. And it's great to see several of the other panelists here today, Nilanthi especially, just to focus on what I would like to take up today. And this is where, coming from Sri Lanka, coming from a country which you would consider a small state, I want to talk about the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but look at it from a small states perspective. As was very rightly said earlier on, I do believe Professor Goswami also reiterated that very often the focus on the Indo-Pacific is from that of a large power perspective. But very often we need to understand countries that sit within the Indo-Pacific. And this is where a common argument is when we look at a country like Sri Lanka, for example. Sri Lanka sits in the middle of the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific and needs to be a critical player in that particular arena. But 2 points that I want to highlight here. And the first one is looking at an overall and overarching understanding of the strategy is absolutely required. This is where, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy, whilst there are numerous Indo-Pacific strategies that have been identified around the world by not only the United States of America, the European Union, Australia, Japan, Indonesia, Germany, so many countries, regions have come together in understanding what this Indo-Pacific strategy is all about. And this is where countries within the Indo-Pacific need to be able to really have clear focus. This is where there needs to be a proper measurement of the impact. When we talk about a strategy and the implementation of a strategy, how is it going to impact negatively or positively on countries within it, especially small states? And small states need to have clear understanding of this measurement of impact. Secondly, how do small states go about maneuvering incidents? There are numerous incidents that unfold in the process of implementing a strategy of this nature. This could be identified to be part of geopolitics, it could be part of geoeconomics, it could be so much more than what we actually see transpiring on the world stage. And this is where we need to look at that capacity development. Thirdly, being able to manifest initiatives suitable for our region, suitable for our country, suitable for our economies. So whilst it's important to measure the impact, while it's important to maneuver incidents and not get caught up in large power play, we also need to be able to manifest initiatives and make sure that they become a reality. But very importantly, we need to be contributing towards molding the Indo-Pacific, molding the strategy as key partners in this particular process, as key stakeholders within the region. This is where, when we look at making sure that the Indo-Pacific is safe, secure, this is very much within the remit of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, where we talk about a safer and more secure South Asia, for example. This is where we are talking about security on a much larger scale. Very often when we hear the word security, the first thing that comes to mind is the military dimension of security. But there are so many other aspects that we need to take on board. How are we bringing in food security? How are we bringing in environmental security, technological security? How are we looking at social security? How are we looking at agricultural security? Also, very importantly, economic security, which is a concern, for example, in a country like Sri Lanka, given what we have experienced in the last few years. So this is where a holistic approach is needed when talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, moving not only within the realm of looking at the maritime, but also going much further, much deeper into understanding what the blue economy is all about, how that is impacting the military dimension, a holistic approach, not just focusing on one aspect of security. And this is where we can ensure inclusion. That inclusion becomes absolutely vital. The second point that I would like to highlight in the panel is that the world is gravitating towards the East, towards Asia. There is heightened interest, heightened communication. For example, as was mentioned just a short while ago, the invitation that was extended to the Chinese president for the inauguration, I think, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, this is unprecedented. That an invitation of that nature has been extended. But of course, this is where we need to understand that bigger picture of what is happening within this century. 2024 is coming to an end, and we are on the eve of the end of the first quarter of this century. 25 years of this century are coming to a close within the next year. This is where we need to understand the impact of this century. If we look at what happened in the last century, if we look at what happened the century before that, it is in that second quarter that we have always seen significant change. In the last century, the second quarter included the Second World War. This had a huge impact on the world order that was formulated thereafter. And this is where we have to watch out for what is unfolding in the quarter to come. But going back to what is dictating the narrative very often, and that is antagonism, animosity. This is where competition is overtaking cooperation. It's very interesting that there is a competition cooperation correlation. We need to be aware of that. We need to understand that. Countries are competing, countries are also cooperating. There is a correlation between the two. We cannot, it's not exclusive, one or the other. In so many sectors where we find countries operating, this needs to be comprehended in a very clear manner. Moving on to that increased interdependence, we talk about trade being that key factor that combines countries or brings countries together. But of course, we need to also go beyond that. Like we talked about all the areas of security, we also need to be conscious of all areas of society, which can be bridges, which can be linkages, which are absolutely essential. Very often we focus too much on how we are looking at differences, how we are looking at how we can identify those differences, but we're not looking at the common denominators. We're not looking at the commonalities that are binding countries. And this is becoming gravely concerning. And especially from a country which is considered to be a small state, it is very essential for us to be able to engage that much closer. This is where enhanced research into what is exactly going on in these arenas. Thankfully, when I look at the panel, I see many people who are from CSOs, who are from academia, who are very much focused on these particular areas. This is where research that is being done has got to be translated into actual policy and policy formulation, which will have an impact, because very often those who are formulating policy are not focused on the bigger picture. They're focused on what is in their national interest. They're focused on what is happening within their countries rather than looking at that bigger picture. Conversion of research into policy. This is where the development of capacity becomes absolutely essential. And of course, greater South-South cooperation, which is one of the key factors for small states. We're going back to a term that might be considered to be from the Cold War era. It might be a term that is concerned to be related very closely with non-alignment. But of course, we're living in an era now in which countries of the global South, as we would like to term them, have a lot of potential of sharing with each other. But finally, before I end, and I'm conscious of time here, I would like to leave you with what I would consider to be the 6 P. Now, what exactly are these? What are countries focused on? What are we trying to attain? We all want power. Countries that have power want to grow their power. Nobody is content. We're not reaching a level of saturation. There's a desire for further power. But power must be converted into potential. We must see the potential of that power being used in a very credible, in a very magnanimous manner, which is going to lead to possibility. The power leading to potential, leading to possibilities, ensure the formulation and implementation of policy. These policies convert into programs. But who are these programs for? These programs are finally for the people. This is where the people of our countries are the ones who've got to be very much kept within the focus. Whether it is the power, whether it is the potential, whether it is the possibilities, whether it is the policy or the programs, finally, whatever we are doing in the Indo-Pacific region, we've got to make sure that people are going to be the recipients of the progress that is being made. And that is where we look at a much safer and more secure Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much, Professor Goswami.
Thank you, Dr. Cooke. I am delighted that you brought the perspective of small states. You pointed to the example of how small states actually are navigating for their own interests in terms of dealing with this framing. I thought your final point is actually important to unpack, which is that when we think about strategies and how the framing of the region has been done, the importance is also to focus on what different populations within a particular country, society are actually prioritizing. I find that useful because I live in the United States now, and what I notice is that even within the US, when we see the elections, what really mattered was putting the priorities of the American population first, right? And so with the America First strategy and economics, that really mattered in the election. So I think that's a very vital point. Great powers also seem to be behaving in that manner. I thought your point about the importance of communication, especially how we are utilizing it in the 21st century with the rise of the internet, is extremely vital. And I think that adds critical dimension of how fast information is being exchanged, right, in terms of how we frame our narrative. So thank you for your perspective, and I'm really happy you brought that to the discussion. There are a lot of questions on chat, so if possible, I would urge my panelists to look at them. I'll try to read them out for the benefit of the audience, but it'll be interesting to just look at them to see how you can, which question you would like to tackle. And there are some great questions for us in the chat. The next speaker is Brandon Donnelly, Fellow, Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers in the United States. Mr. Donnelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, perfect. So again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, also for reaching out to the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. So I kind of wanted to talk first before going into my main points. So I have to also say my opinions and points are not a part of the United States government or any of the departments underneath the Department of Defense at all. So my methodology, first off, is focused on kind of three big pillars. First off is what is strategic or what is strategy overarching? And so that's focused on intent, history, and capability. So I've talked about previously that history is a huge piece to the Indo-Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific, all the countries within the Indo-Pacific region have a long memory for what history actually looks like. But I really want to focus on what intent looks like first, and that's the grand national strategy for each of the countries within. So I couldn't remember exactly who it was. I think it was one of the previous ones was talking about the good, the bad, and the in between. So that look is kind of where I want to look at for intent. Not saying who's good, who's bad, or who's in between, but there are multiple different sides to this. So I think it's been a big point of just overarching sovereignty. So I think there are a lot of military actions that take place in the Indo-Pacific. So that is just one of the ways that instruments of national power actually get used. But intent is more than just what the military looks like. So I think at least on one side there is the Chinese government, and they're looking a lot at the South China Sea, the East China Sea, especially what's considered the Nine Dash Line. That in itself has diplomatic, information, military, and economic perspectives to it, and so that's kind of where I wanted to start off for a second. Is with the Chinese, they're looking at rejuvenation right now. By 2049, that's one of the big pieces of intent that has been presented by President Xi Jinping. And so, what that potentially looks like is the reunification with Taiwan, that is control of the South China Sea, and realistically, by 2027, a military that is capable of actually carrying out China's national objectives. And what that could look like is offshore defense right now, with whatever's going on within that South China Sea. I know that that's already been brought up before, about the kind of the altercations that have been going on and the conflict so far between the coast guards. So having the capability to enforce control over what China considers its sovereign territory, its own operational area, so that could even span into the Indian Ocean. That could span out beyond just what would be considered brown water into the blue water side of things. So past the first island chain into the second island chain. Then you have kind of like what would be considered in the middle is where you get ASEAN, all the smaller countries, in between the two larger powers, China and the United States, as making sure that I think what we've already talked about is maintaining sovereignty. Is even though that China and the United States is two of the largest economies in the world and two of the largest militaries, all the smaller states are looking at, we want to still maintain our sovereignty. So that is kind of their grand national strategy, is maintaining their diplomatic ties, maintaining their military, maintaining their economic ties as well. They don't want to be forgotten when there's a strategic competition between the United States and China. And I think I won't touch on it as much because I think Ms. Lisa Curtis really touched on the United States strategy very well on that side of things. So I think there's another piece beyond just the overarching intent, is the actual capability to perform the intent that each of these countries is discussing. So I think for the Chinese, there's also three phases of acting on this intent. These are the ways that they're going to be using their strategy, which is the acting, the coercion, and the actual enforcement of their intent. So we saw this within the South China Sea. Realistically, is in 2017 the man-made islands were complete, and so that was the actual action. Then you have the coercion of saying, okay, this is now this is historic claims over the Chinese territory. Now it is the actual enforcing of this is the acceptance of that territory. I think that's where mostly in the South China Sea that dispute really comes in. Is I think the last panel that I was listening to was talking about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and so that consternation immediately shows kind of where intent between multiple countries and the grand national strategy really come into place. And so the other point that I would want to make on the Western on kind of what the future might look like, because I'm going to be basically using the same model of intent capabilities and history as what have we seen, what are we actually hearing some of the leaders talking about, and what are the capabilities to enforce their intent. And so I think a couple of the points that have been made is that we're going to see a lot of the same. But I think from one of the first panelists was talking about their three COAs between a null COA, little change, and large change. It's going to be difficult to figure out which one it is, but I don't think it's going to be null. That would probably be my argument. I don't think that the countries are going to do nothing. Um, I also don't think that in terms of large change, there's not going to be a huge overarching conflict. I think most countries, United States, China, and all the smaller countries are relatively against large scale military conflict, because that would be a huge economic cost. That would be a huge loss of life. That would be at a global scale impacting more than just the United States and China. So that's why I almost go towards COA 2, which is a little bit of change as we move forward. That's my own personal opinion. And so the way I really see that coming out is another panelist also talked about how I think that was Dr. Miao that was talking about Japan as the originator of a couple of different things. And one of those is the free and open Indo-Pacific. So the free and open Indo-Pacific is also part of the United States strategy now. I think that is part of what would be considered COA 2, which is the little change, where movement towards enforcing a free and Indo-Pacific following the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, I think is going to be where the Indo-Pacific strategy is really going to come into play. I think multiple people have brought up AUKUS. I think AUKUS will also kind of grow. And so the point that I see that is it's not just going to be Australia, UK, and the United States, because I think New Zealand is also looking at AUKUS as well. Not so much on the nuclear side, but potentially on the advanced weaponry and technology side. So those kinds of military agreements between the United States and New Zealand might also grow. And who's to say? I was talking to other scholars before about Indonesia potentially. That could be something that would assist Indonesia as well. Is maybe not AUKUS as you would think it, but some kind of military cooperation between the United States or any of the Western nations with Indonesia. But it would basically be something along the lines of the Belt and Road Initiative, but I guess from originating from the United States, is because those are the two different strategies that are competing. Is you have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is providing a lot of economic support to a lot of countries within the Indo-Pacific, even into Africa as well. So AUKUS, even though it might not look like it, is kind of like the military portion of what the United States might bring to bear to support some of their allies in the Indo-Pacific. I guess those are the main points that I wanted to bring up outside of economics and military. So, pending any questions, I think those were my big points on what the strategic perspective of the Indo-Pacific might look like in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. the framework that you provided in terms of intent being the most important factor and then follows capability. Um, the one thing that I would want to hear more in the discussion is when you use the word intent, that itself is such a difficult narrative to actually discern, right? So why are nations doing what they're doing? What is the intention, strategic at the national level? There could be some nations that want to do a particular activity and develop a capacity because they have a very regional level intent. Other nations have more global. So how does that impact the Indo-Pacific and what capacities that they are actually building? And sometimes intent can also work at cross purposes. The one thing I noticed in the Indo-Pacific is that because of the future and what we are seeing happen, which is prosperity, economic development focus, intentions of most of the nations seem to be that they want stability, right? And so how much the current security environment challenges that is something that would be useful to discuss. But thank you for your comments, and I look forward to the discussion following the speaker in the question and answer. Our next speaker and last speaker is Dr. Scott Edwards, Research Fellow, Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, Japan. Dr. Edwards, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. So my small intervention, I guess, is mostly drawing on a project that I'm working with a colleague at the University of Bristol, Robert Yates, where we're kind of critically reflecting on some of the UK's kind of Indo-Pacific engagement. So kind of be talking from a bit more of a UK perspective. And I think because it's a story, we tell this kind of story through the UK's engagement with Southeast Asia around kind of pillars like green financing, maritime security cooperation, quite granular cases. But I think the kind of pathologies that are there in the interaction has these kind of lessons to be learned, I guess, like beyond just the UK, beyond just Southeast Asia. And ultimately, we kind of get to this point where we're trying to essentially, I guess, advocate this idea that future strategies need to think much more innovatively about how to kind of, I guess, like co-construct notions of common good in the region and how to achieve them, and actually focus on building long-term equitable partnerships, which should be at the core of strategies related to the Indo-Pacific, I think, because that's the only way to kind of unlock some of the opportunities that will be discussed already in the panel. I think so where we kind of talk about this and what we're interested in is, the UK's engagement has been very much framed in this the Indo-Pacific as a theatre for competition between China and the free world, and not necessarily strongly explored as being a kind of complex and diverse region that presents a lot of opportunities, despite having that in the strategies itself, right, in the IR refresh, integrated review refresh, not actually kind of putting this into practice. And we highlight it as obstacles to kind of moving beyond just kind of simplistic framing of the Indo-Pacific as a lack of institutional expertise in the UK around the Indo-Pacific, kind of problems or pathologies with the UK's diplomatic culture, and also a kind of recognition or a lack of recognition of different scales of governance in the region and just who we should be engaging with. And these all relate to kind of everyday functioning, I guess, of UK diplomacy in the region. But I think it also reinforces some of the barriers to the UK's overarching strategic approach. And I think it has lessons to be learned for kind of extra regional powers who want to engage with the Indo-Pacific and who are ultimately engaging more frequently. So when we kind of dig into this, I guess, time short, I turn to like one of the case studies. But we focus in, or what we're interested in, is the UK's programming around maritime security and what that ultimately speaks to how different states are engaging the region to show some of those difficulties and outcomes. So I guess like very brief context, but the UK's programming is fairly integrated, but UK support for maritime security in Southeast Asia, I guess, we broadly divided between Ministry of Defence led forms of intervention and some of the kind of technical capacity building and assistance led by the Foreign Office, the FCDO. The MOD intervention has primarily been provided by the Royal Navy, forward presence of 2 OPVs, like a maritime domain awareness program, which is very active in the region. But in terms of I think the more interesting story is some of the kind of diplomatic approaches and assistance led by the Foreign Office. So the Foreign Office has prioritized maritime security in a lot of the bilateral relationships with the region. There's strategic dialogues published with Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, and these all have quite a strong focus on maritime security. In practice, the implementation of the UK's approach is primarily through, we have an integrated security fund, the UK's integrated security fund, which is a cross-governmental cabinet office-led fund that kind of bolsters efforts to prevent conflict and build stability overseas. That's the kind of the overarching aims. And the ISF funding is said to have lots of benefits. It's meant to be integrated, it's meant to be catalytic, and it's meant to be extremely agile. It's able to kind of engage in high risk programming. And the UK, the objectives of this in the region is to secure a values-driven, secure, prosperous, and sustainable maritime sector in Southeast Asia, conforming to the law of the sea that reduces the threat to UK security and interests at home and abroad. And I guess the kind of tangibility in practice programming includes things like port security assessments in partnership with the Department for Transport, maritime domain awareness assessments in partnership with the Ministry of Defence, port state measure projects in partnership with DEFRA and stuff like that. But the story we get to it, I guess the kind of problems and how this speaks to strategizing about the Indo-Pacific is to kind of focus on some of the problems of programming that relies on assumptions that concern the strength of expertise from the West. Many of much of the programming is kind of characterized by flows of information from UK government stakeholders to partners in the region. It's not necessarily a dialogue. And we kind of frame this assumption of expertise, Western expertise, as problematic for three reasons. First, because we have significant domain knowledge, I think, in maritime security in the UK, but the depth of regional expertise isn't yet as fully developed. The region itself has significant unrecognized expertise in relation to maritime security, where the UK positions itself as a contributor. Think about Indonesia's activity around like UNCLOS negotiations and stuff like that. And also, there's a kind of inability or a lack of reflexivity in terms of wanting to learn from regional states, including in areas where the UK faces similar challenges, particularly thinking around things like the intersection between maritime and environmental security, where the UK's governance hasn't kind of cohered. What we suggest and what we're kind of focused in on is that this kind of hierarchical cooperation leads to a lot of pathologies in the way the region is ultimately approached. There's kind of limited opportunities for dialogue, and they're very much centered on fixing the region's problems rather than kind of engaging with the region on its own terms. We see these kind of limited spaces for mutual interaction as creating a lot of obstacles to developing partnerships, not getting buy-in from kind of identified partners, or limiting the types of group that the UK is engaging with and excluding like marginalized stakeholders who are also impacted by maritime insecurities and stuff like that. We also think, so there's kind of pathologies there in who the UK is engaging with. I think there's pathologies in the kind of what the UK is doing in this space as well. It's taken a long time to kind of hone a differentiated order in what's already a kind of very crowded space. And it comes very much from this kind of preconceived notion of what the problem is and how to solve it, which I think limits the kind of responsiveness to the regional needs and limits the kind of flexibility that the UK is able to engage in. So I think for us, this is a kind of very granular case, kind of looking at this very day-to-day programming. But I think it very much highlights those limitations that occur when states have a preconceived notion of what the Indo-Pacific is. They have this kind of specific framing of it, and these are applied across the board to regional states. and comes very much from this from that framing that was discussed earlier, and therefore kind of moving forward and thinking on how to strategize about the Indo-Pacific, that there needs to be a much more stronger focus on how to kind of co-construct notions of common good, because ultimately that impacts the way that we're also constructing the region. So it's much more an advocacy for kind of much more two-way dialogue around the region and how to approach the region, and not applying those preconceived notions of what it is. Sorry, I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I think we started with that particular framing that is utilized with Dr. Gupta, and we ended with that. So it's a very interesting coming feedback loop. I thought your point about domain expertise being one thing, but regional expertise being another is extremely vital, because when we use domain expertise, we do sometimes generalize, and so specific, as you use the word co-construction of a particular regional expertise, is extremely vital. The one point I thought you brought out in terms of the importance of building institutionalized capability, which stands the test of time in terms of regional expertise, was vital. So thank you for those contribution. So we have about 20 minutes for discussion. So there are certain questions in the chat that are very specific to a particular panelist. So if you could have a look at that. And when I turn the mic over to you, it'll be great if you could read the question out for the benefit of the audience. But there is one question I thought which is overarching, which is asked by Jenny Ray, which says that given the increasing proximity between India and Russia, as well as the potential for improved relations between India and China, especially with National Security Advisor Ajit Doval's upcoming visit to China tomorrow, how do you envision the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy evolving? What implications might these developments have in the US approach to regional security and its alliances in the region? So I think that's something it'll be useful to discuss. Let me see if there are questions which are very specific to Nilanthi. I think Lisa Curtis, you have certain questions for you, which are again specific. Brandon, there's a question for you. And so Antoine, you have your hand up.
Sure, thank you. I'm not a US national, so perhaps I won't sort of lead on the US question, but I have done some work on the India-China side of that triangle. And I just want to say on that one important factor is that it's about setting the right expectations. And I think the current state of the India-China relationship, as we have seen it unfold in the last 3 months or so, is the result of an evolution which started before. Some of it became visible over the spring, and I think it might even be older than that. And the result of that has been that it's helped manage expectations on all sides of that triangle, to the extent where I think it's quite clear what the three different poles of that triangle stand for and expect of the two others. Mr. Doval's visit tomorrow to Beijing will be especially important, and it's a new precedent post GAL1 in that respect, so since 2020. But I wouldn't expect that to generate significantly new initiatives which would find their way into quick implementation. I'll put a couple of links to things I've written on the chat if anyone's interested on this. The other point was, I think, Lisa's excellent cautionary note on the Indian Ocean. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, we had a session on the Indian Ocean, and it was remarkable then how much consensus there was, including the Chinese who were present, how much consensus there was about not securitizing, let alone militarizing the Indian Ocean region more than it already was at the time. We had another session, a repeat of that session, if you would like, at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. So 2024, 6 years later. And the mood was very, very different. The fact that militarization has taken place is a fait accompli, which is now informing strategies. I think we should watch this space very, very carefully indeed. And the last point I want to make is about the UK and the point which was made about the lack of or the relative lack of expertise. I think there's tremendous expertise in the UK. The difficulty of the issues is that we're now looking at articulation of statecraft and private sector interests. And that's a challenge for everyone in the West, not just in the UK. It's a challenge for the United States also. So it's articulating areas of domain expertise in practical, pragmatic, tangible ways, which really is the challenge. And I think we're all learning from that. But to tally on this with the earlier point I made on technology, you just have to look at the scale of ambition in the Technology Security Initiative, which the UK unveiled with India in July, to look at how much the UK-India relationship, has moved towards security, but also way beyond it. And there's a whole host of issues here which the two countries are looking to work towards. So these are just practical examples of some of the things we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to Dr. Gupta, and I'll request all of you to keep your remarks to about, or responses to about 2 minutes. I'm sorry, in the interest of time, we have about 15 minutes left. Pramod did say that I can extend it by a few minutes, so we'll see how it goes. So let's start with Dr. Gupta, if you have any responses to the questions posed or to the narrative that we discussed.
I'll just say two things. When you look at India, China, and India, Russia, here's the bottom line. When the Indians have a choice between guns and butter, they consistently opt for butter. Look at how they've spent money on, and butter being social welfare programs, okay? And not in the way the Americans think social welfare, the way the Europeans think social welfare, which is something different. Now, because of that, China is very important to India. It's its largest trading partner. And if you read the Economic Survey of India, which I recommend as a primary source to all of you, it says very clearly, we either go China +1 or we get Chinese foreign direct investment. And that is what they're looking for very seriously. 70% of India's cell phone market is dominated by the Chinese. Now, come to the Russians. You get weapons from the Russians, you get technology. The next generation of cryo engines is going to come from Russia. It's not going to come from the United States. You'll never get it. I was chairing a panel yesterday where they said, well, we'll get something out of AUKUS. You'll get zero out of AUKUS. Okay. Unfortunately, all that will come from the Russians. And good luck getting a nuclear submarine on lease today. That's another story which I don't want to get into. Bottom line for the Indians is very simply this. They're going to go where they find the money for social and economic development. And that's the same thing across Asia. I'll just point out one thing. The ASEAN countries went to Joe Biden and said, can you open up your markets for us? That's what we really want. And Biden couldn't do it because of the very peculiar domestic politics we're going through in the United States right now. Everybody is anti-globalization. Good luck with that one. So the point is, until the United States can offer a vision for the Indo-Pacific, which involves the development of economies, the protection of environment, and puts its money where its mouth is, the Chinese are going to have a strategic advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Ms. Samaranayake, you also have questions in the chat for you. So.
Yes, thank you, Professor Goswami. Yes, I'll take your first question that you posed to me about the tonality and organizational shift toward the Indo-Pacific that occurred from that Asia-Pacific conception and why that shift took place. I think really the US allies, particularly Japan and Australia, helped shape the US approach to conceiving of the Indo-Pacific region. At the same time, I think there was also a national strategic objective in terms of cultivating a partnership with India that had taken place for roughly a decade up until that point. So I think those were two of the major drivers in that shift that we saw from the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. But it was interesting to see, even under the Obama administration, which I didn't talk about, but there was discussion even then about even the PACOM commander, Pacific commander at the time, talked about the Indo-Asia Pacific. And then you had other parts of government, the State Department, talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor. So there were these shifts and discussions, but at what was, I think, useful about the Trump administration was really picking the Indo-Pacific and going with it. There was a streamlining in terms of the US's official characterization of the region, the articulation of US interest in the region. So it had a clarifying effect. But you're right to ask about the organizational shift. For example, with the US Department of Defense, the Unified Command Plan did not change with the renaming of Indo-Pacific Command from Pacific Command. But the Indian Ocean, for example, there's still 3 combatant commands that have responsibility for planning in the Indian Ocean. But those shifts do take place if and when they're necessary, as we saw with the example of Israel. In terms of changing the combatant command responsibility for that. And then the question about smaller states, I think George did a great job talking about interests and perspectives from smaller states. I will just add to Mira's question for me about smaller South Asian states. I'm writing a book on that topic right now. And I think some of the important factors at work there are governance. Essentially, all 5 smaller South Asian states, they hold democratic elections, but at the same time, they're facing challenges in terms of the governance approaches within those countries. Economics is an important factor. All 5 smaller South Asian countries, they've now achieved lower middle income status, according to the World Bank, with Nepal's accession in graduation in 2020. And they all occupy strategic geography and have important security and defense relations with large powers like the United States and in India and China. And another concept, we're talking about the Indian Ocean and smaller states. I'll just bring back into our discussion here the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. That was an important discourse that was offered by smaller states. Sri Lanka really led the charge on that in the 70s, and that was at another time of strategic competition between large powers. So I think it does point to not only the agency, but the numerical majorities and pluralities of smaller states and their power to shape the discourse and not necessarily just accept implicit assumptions about large power rivalry. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Dr. G, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding your question about emerging technology, I say China, is there any question for me? I didn't see any, sorry. So I'm talking about the question you raised before.
Yeah, just those 2 questions in terms of Japan designing and the emerging technology. I don't see a question for you in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. First, emerging technology. China is now investing very heavily in emerging technologies like AI, space exploration, and among others. But this is not to achieve technological hegemony like the United States. So it's more about because now we are having sanctions, and the sanctions from the US has made China to realize not our strengths, but really our limitations. So when the outside or high cutting edge technology is not accessible for China, we need something alternative, which is somewhat inferior but usable. So we need to do that, continue to do that. Of course, we are making some progress. And the other thing is that we see emerging technology as not really an area of a strategic competition. It is critical, but we say that it is still an area for possible or meaningful cooperation, especially in the terms of rulemaking or say those technologies that may be used for addressing global warming, like clean energy, sort of thing. And a relatively welcome move is that the 2 governments has recently decided not to suspend the agreement on science and technological cooperation. So in terms of Japan, I see that the Indo-Pacific is really a very to the Japanese philosophy that is to manage the Chinese challenge within a greater geographical scope from Asian to the Asian Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. So I think this because American power leadership is ubiquitous. It doesn't have a limitation for any geographical thinking. Everywhere would be within the American reach and control, I should say. So a second thing is that Japan play a very important role for making the Quad. Without Japan, there would be no Quad actually, and without Japan, there would be no ASEAN outlook for Indo-Pacific. And so without Japan, the European policy engagement of the Indo-Pacific will not be materialized. So Japan is really critical for that, and America knows very well. But I should also need to say that Japan has a tradition, especially since the Abe Shinzo times. They have an approach to really, to manage I try to engage a bridge and manage the great power competition instead of really siding with the United States side. So this is very true. I think Ishiba government he is very much similar to Abe Shinzo, so that's why he's a very strong competitor for him. So has already shown some autonomy or independence from the United States, and in security, in economic, in other sense too. So I think that will make a relatively or somewhat soften the Indo-Pacific in the following years. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Antoine, do you have anything more to add to what you responded, or?
No, thank you very much. I made my main points clear earlier, so I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Pejsova, floor is yours.
Two questions, one on polarization within Europe and one on its contribution to maritime security and blue economy. Just very quickly, of course, we need to remind ourselves that the EU is a constellation of 27 sovereign democracies. So we are never safe from each of them having their own visions and opinions and foreign policies. That's why when you see a French carrier or frigate in the Indo-Pacific, it will be a French initiative or a German initiative, etc. Nonetheless, all the documents that you will come across as council conclusions are all consensus-based, so you can rely on them, right? So you can basically assume that the 27 agreed on whatever has been out. And frankly, and we'll see under the new administration now, there is a broad agreement on increasing defense spendings, competitiveness, and innovation. I mean, these are some of the top priorities that we'll definitely see in the new commission. On maritime, frankly, there's been a lot that the EU is doing, and I will not go into the details, but just for the sea lines of communication, one of the biggest initiatives is enhancing maritime domain awareness. In fact, there's even cooperation now between the EU's Crimario and the EORIS platform with the Quad. So that's a great way forward. I think it's two systems that are basically complementary, one using the satellite imagery system and one using a locally based, so I call it basically like a Waze for ships. That's one example, but also working a lot with some of the regional organizations. So the Indian Ocean Commission is almost funded, 80% of its budget is funded by the EU through the French. I would argue there's a lot of need, an opportunity to work with smaller formations such as BIMSTEC. There's also on fisheries, on law enforcement, on coastal management, you name it. And just to conclude, I think in maritime, one of the EU's unique selling propositions is precisely the experience that it had in maritime multilateralism. So managing 27 member states and trying to put this blue economic footprint on the EU has been a long journey. But it's a very, very interesting one to anyone who wants to implement any sort of maritime governance at the regional level. So there's a lot of work with ASEAN typically, because of course you need to harmonize all the all the national approaches, but also work on the public, private, and civil and military cooperation. There's a very unique approach to doing it, which has been tested in countering piracy, for instance, in the Arabian Sea, etc. I will stop at that because there's definitely a lot to say, but clearly maritime, or more the civilian management of maritime security, is one aspect where the EU can help.
Thank you for that. Ms. Curtis, floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I'll quickly go through the questions that you asked, but as well as there's one in the chat. On the issue of what, there's some skepticism about the phrase rules-based order. What does that mean? What kind of normative structure are we talking about? I would simply say that countries of the region are going to choose themselves what kind of order they would like. And I would guess that countries will want an order in which they have their own sovereignty and independence. They control their borders and the resources within their borders and their maritime zones. They would support peaceful resolution of conflict. They would support an order that does not accept bullying, intimidation, coercion, but instead stresses cooperation, empowerment, and these types of things. So I think that it is a bit nebulous when we say rules-based order, but the implication really is about countries being able to maintain their own sovereignty and independence and make their own choices. And then the second question was about the leadership structure, and I guess the implication being, how is the Trump administration going to lead when it comes to the direction of the Indo-Pacific? And here I would raise that the U.S. support for democratic development, democratic systems is a strength. It's I think the U.S. superpower. What we know is governments that are responsive to their people are more peaceful, prosperous countries. They're better partners for the United States. And we've certainly seen some major changes in governance and democratic development when it comes to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, which has seen, sort of a revolving door of governments, but still is a vibrant democracy after facing challenges from monarchical rule and a violent Maoist insurgency for so many years. So I think the U.S. strength is its support for democracy and democratic development. It may not be a perfect form of government, but it is the best option out there. And the third question comes from the chat, which I was asked about the impact of Trump's invitation to President Xi and what that means to the inauguration and what that means for the future of the Indo-Pacific. And I would just say that I think what this invitation shows us is that the Trump 2 policy toward China is going to be very multifaceted. Yes, it's going to be characterized by competition and, all the things that I discussed, but there will also be a continuation of the engagement. We saw this starting in the second half of the Biden administration. I would expect that the Trump administration will try to keep that focus. And, there'll be a focus by the Trump administration on getting a good trade deal for the American people. We often forget that in January 2020, during the first Trump term, the U.S. completed the first phase trade deal with China. Now we can talk about, whether that was successful or not, but I think my point is that, there was engagement. It wasn't this sort of policy that was, only down one track. It was multifaceted. And I think we'll continue to see that. We'll see the competitive element playing out, but we'll also see an effort on the economic front to, continue the economic relationships, but in a way that, protects intellectual property, is, characterized by fair trading, and all of those types of things. So that's how I think that we should see this invitation to to the inauguration.
Thank you, Ms. Curtins. Now we have Dr. Cooke. If you have anything to add.
Thank you, Professor. Just to reiterate what was said earlier, in terms of the small states perspective, understanding that small states also stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific strategy and have to be at the table. There's got to be clear strategizing on the part of the small states to begin with. They've also got to understand that the role they play in the bigger picture of the Indo-Pacific strategy and in the Indo-Pacific in general, not just in terms of the strategy, but also on the part of large powers who need to be conscious of the fact that small states also play a role, also contribute towards the economy, also have a role to play and cannot be ignored and have to be present in all fora, not only in multilateral gatherings, but also when it comes to specific fora when it is focused on a topic like the Indo-Pacific. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Donnelly, I think there's a question for you as well in the chat, if I remember.
Yes, and the question that you were talking about for intent, I think time-wise, I don't think I can cover it well enough for intent. So I think I want to focus just in the chat. So a point was talked about because I was mentioning the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that the U.S. has not actually is not signed it or has ratified it. So that's why personal opinion, not of the U.S. government, I think the United States needs to sign on to that and to ratify that, is because in a globalized society, if a country is not going to accept the globalized society, or just the globalization, then they could be left behind. If you are more isolationist and you don't play, if you don't play with everybody else, then people aren't going to play with you, and you're kind of left in the dust. So that's why I think, realistically, that the United States and China both need to play into the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And then the second part was about AUKUS. I know it was brought up a couple of times, and I focused on it, so I was asking for the hurt. So the question focused on Pillar 1, talking about the concerns that the United States wouldn't be able to deliver the nuclear submarines, the Virginia-class submarines, to the Australians, because the current production for those types of submarines is about 1 per year, but for AUKUS it needs to be 2. And then the second pillar is the advanced military technology. And so I guess my response to the concerns would be, it really is going to come down to what is prioritized within the United States. Is part of the grand national strategy is going to be between domestic policy and international policy. And so if there's more of a focus on domestic policy, then that production might stay stagnant. But if there's a focus on international policy and growing that military technology cooperation with other countries, then we could see an increase in the production for those kinds of submarines. So it's realistically going to be a balance. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to speculate on what that could look like. But thank you for the time.
Thank you. Dr. Edwards?
Yeah, thank you. I don't see any questions for me, but just wanted to turn to the expertise thing, I think, because this is a difficult question in the sense of even where there is expertise, there's kind of like not sufficiently linked up. There's not really like the institutional structures in place and like slow to mobilize. So it's in some ways an institutional problem. But I think the broader advocacy, I guess, is to better engage with experts in the region, because that also solves some of the hierarchical problems as well. And we've seen some movement towards this. The UK, for example, holds an annual maritime security forum in Bali, which is characterized by the kind of centering of regional voices. And I think this has been really key to honing what the UK's offer is to the region and what kind of engagement there is there. But for me, I think we need to do more of this. The UK needs to do more of this because it overcomes that danger, I guess, that you can like institutionalize certain perspectives over others or privilege certain perspectives over others without enough reflexivity, and that could be dangerous for kind of broader strategizing. When you mentioned the public-private difficulties, I think that's shown by green financing, where we see, generally speaking, UK-based consultancy firms chosen as partners for project delivery, including like massive areas like UK Pact. And it kind of reproduces this assumed knowledge that incentivizing private financing is the solution to funding sustainable infrastructure. It kind of solves all the problems. But a lack of deeper stakeholder engagement doesn't allow for that notion to be challenged or honed sufficiently. And I think that's where the opportunities are, and that's why that kind of broader advocacy. I'll just end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've run a little more on time, but Antoine, I saw your hand up for a quick intervention.
Very quick. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you to answer one of your questions, which was how to cooperate more on a regional basis on technology. And it occurred to me during our discussion that all states, big and small, are part of the UN. And there are two interesting sets of discussions ongoing at the UN, and they're in the form of open-ended working groups. There's one on cyber, there's one on civilian space, which tackles space situational awareness, etc. And this is a place where countries like Nepal can cast a vote, can take a stand on these issues in a way which really can garner a majority of states in the middle ground between major states. So I think that's important, and they'll find that a number of countries are alongside their views on these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up the open-ended working group, because as you said, nations like Nepal can actually contribute meaningfully. I've seen other nations, for example, from Africa as well, play a very vital role. So thank you for that. Well, we've come to the end of our discussion. I learned a lot from all the excellent points, and thank you for that. Thank you for keeping to time, and thank you for the questions that were asked. So from my part, thank you so much to everyone for your time and your contribution to the discussion. I hand over the mic to Dr. Jaswal.